He was just a struggling farmer with nothing left but 8 wrinkled dollars in his pocket, until the day he raised his hand at a dusty auction and claimed a wild gray colt no one else dared to touch. They called him a fool, but that reckless choice would set in motion a story of storms, confessions, and second chances, leading to a bond so powerful it could heal not only a horse, but an entire life. The auction yard in Kansas was a furnace of dust and heat that afternoon, the kind of summer day when the horizon rippled like molten glass. Farmers stood in groups beneath wide-brimmed hats, their murmurs blending with the rhythmic crack of the auctioneer's gavel. Ethan Miller leaned on the faded railing, his shirt clinging to his back, fingers pressing against the 8 crumpled dollars he had left in the world. $8. Barely enough to buy gas for the old tractor, much less a horse. Yet he was here, chasing something he couldn't quite name. The man at the podium called for the next lot, and the handlers wrestled a young gray colt into the pen. The animal exploded into the open space with the force of a storm, eyes rolling white, hooves striking sparks off the boards. People stepped back, laughing nervously. Someone muttered, "That devil's good for nothing but trouble." The auctioneer's voice tried to stretch optimism over the chaos, but even he faltered. No one bid. Not a single hand rose. The colt, muscles quivering under a coat the color of ashes, was already condemned by silence. Ethan's throat tightened. In that restless pacing, he saw himself. The way folks in town had looked at him since the harvest failed, since the bank letters piled up on the kitchen table, since his wife packed her bags one quiet morning and never came back. He knew the weight of being called worthless. He knew what it was to be unwanted. And something deep inside refused to let this animal's story end here. 8, Ethan heard himself say, voice cracked and strange, as if someone else had spoken through him. Heads turned. The crowd chuckled at the absurdity. $8 for a wild horse no one dared touch. But the gavel came down all the same. And just like that, Ethan had traded his last bills for a colt everyone else believed belonged to death. When the lead rope was shoved into his calloused hands, the colt lunged, nearly yanking him off his feet. Dust billowed, and laughter echoed in his ears. But Ethan set his boots into the earth, whispering low, steady words only the horse could hear. For a fleeting second, the animal's frantic eyes met his, and something sparked. Fear, yes, but also recognition. 2 lost souls, bound together by a single desperate gamble. That night, as the sun bled out across the Kansas fields, Ethan drove the old truck home, with the colt tied in the rattling trailer. The farmhouse roof sagged against the horizon, his father's rocking chair creaked on the porch, and the air smelled of dry corn and old wood. He had brought home not a solution, not a miracle, but a mirror of his own brokenness. He named him quietly, almost to himself. Ash. A reminder of what remains after the fire burns everything else away. And as the colt's hooves struck the boards of the small corral, restless and wild, Ethan realized his life had shifted in a way he could not undo. $8 had bought him far more than a horse. It had bought him a chance, fragile as smoke, to discover whether ruin could be turned into redemption. The colt's hooves rang against the wooden boards of the corral, each strike a defiant drumbeat that carried across the Kansas dusk. Ethan leaned on the fence, arms folded, his face shadowed by the brim of a sweat-stained hat. The horse was restless, circling like a storm confined in too small a sky, gray coat darkened by sweat, muscles twitching with a violence that seemed always ready to ignite. Every time the animal tossed its head, the rope halter snapped taut, creaking under the strain. The sound set Ethan's teeth on edge, but he did not flinch. He only watched. The old farmhouse behind him sagged in silence, its windows catching the last embers of daylight. His father, frail from years of illness, had retreated indoors after murmuring that Ethan might be making another mistake. Yet Ethan stayed by the corral, steadying his breath in rhythm with the colts, as if he could will calm into the space between them. The animal's eyes were wide, whites glinting under the dimming sun, but every so often those eyes locked with his, raw, searching, almost accusing. It was in that gaze that Ethan saw a reflection of himself, the bankruptcy notices folded into drawers, the empty chair across the kitchen table, the silence of a marriage gone cold. "Your name is Ash," he whispered into the twilight. Not a shout, not a command, just a truth spoken low enough for the Colt alone. Ash. The residue left after everything else has burned. Fragile, gray, overlooked. Yet in its quiet way, ash is proof of survival. Fires destroy, but ashes remain. The horse gave no sign of understanding, only pawed the dirt with impatient energy, sending up small clouds that drifted in the evening light. Still, the name settled into Ethan's bones like something inevitable. He leaned against the fence post, letting the rough grain press into his back, and thought of the weight that name carried. Ash was not just the Colt, it was what Ethan himself had become. A man left behind by fortune, by family, by time. That night, after feeding the animal hay he could scarcely afford, Ethan sat on the porch steps with a chipped mug of black coffee. From there he could see Ash pacing the corral, restless as the wind that sighed through the dry corn stalks. The moon was climbing, silvering the colt's coat until it gleamed like metal under a forge. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt the faint stir of something other than exhaustion. Curiosity, perhaps, or the thin thread of purpose. The farmhouse groaned in the night breeze, and from inside came the cough of his father, a reminder of the weight Ethan carried. Bills waited on the counter. Crops thirsted in the fields. And now, as if the burden weren't heavy enough, a half-wild colt consumed his last dollars and his dwindling energy. Yet he couldn't look away. Something in that animal's refusal to surrender, in its raw defiance against the rope and rail, struck at a place deep inside him he thought long since burned out. Ethan thought of the folks at the auction yard, the laughter that followed his bid, the pity in some eyes, the scorn in others. They had seen only danger and waste. He had seen fear disguised as fury, a mirror of his own. Maybe that was foolishness. Maybe it was desperation. But as Ash lifted its head, breath steaming into the cool night air, Ethan felt the echo of a vow unspoken. They would not give up on each other, no matter what the world said. The first stars blinked awake above the fields, and Ethan rose, stretching his aching back. Tomorrow would bring chores, debts, and the stubborn work of survival. But tonight, standing in the hush of the Kansas plains, he allowed himself a moment of stillness. Ash paced, then paused, ears flicking toward the farmhouse light, and for one suspended heartbeat the colt stood quiet. Ethan caught his breath at the fragile peace of it, a silence that felt like the beginning of something neither man nor beast yet understood. He turned toward the door, coffee cup empty, his father waiting inside. Behind him, in the corral, Ash stamped once and blew through its nostrils, the sound sharp in the night. A challenge, perhaps, or an answer. Either way, Ethan knew the name had stuck. Ash was no longer just a wild colt. It was the promise of survival etched into living flesh. And as the farmhouse door closed softly behind him, the bond of two broken things had already begun to weave itself in the quiet Kansas dark. Morning light seeped across the horizon like a slow spill of gold, brushing the dry fields and the tired barn with its fragile warmth. Ethan awoke to the sound of his father's cough echoing through the thin walls of the farmhouse. It was a sound he knew too well. Wet, ragged, punctuated with long pauses that left Ethan holding his breath until the next gasp came. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, feet touching the creaking floorboards, and for a moment he sat still, head bowed in the pale glow filtering through the curtain. The farmhouse was a testament to years of labor wearing thin. Paint peeled from the clapboards, windows rattled in their frames, and the roof sagged as though it carried the same burden as its owner. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood smoke and medicine, a mingling of endurance and decay. On the kitchen table lay a stack of envelopes Ethan refused to open that morning, the ink-stamped demands from the bank, reminders that time was not on their side. He filled a kettle, set it on the stove, and let the whistle cover the silence between himself and his father. When Ethan stepped out onto the porch with his coffee, the corral came into view. Ash was already awake, nostrils flaring, hooves restless on the packed earth. The horse's gray coat glinted under the rising sun, but there was no peace in him yet, only a pacing energy that scraped at Ethan's nerves. Every turn around the pen was a reminder of the choice he had made, a choice his father still questioned. The old man had said little the night before, only, "You've taken on more than you should," before shuffling back to his chair. That silence cut deeper than reproach. Ethan leaned on the railing, watching the colt, and thought of the fields stretching beyond, rows of corn stunted by drought, soybeans brittle under their leaves. Once, this land had been a source of pride. His grandfather's hands had built the fences, turned the soil, raised cattle in pastures that now stood empty. Ethan carried those memories like weights, each one whispering that he was the link where the chain had broken. He had failed where others had endured. And now, tethered to his last dollars, he had brought home a creature the whole town believed would break him further. Ash stopped abruptly, ears flicking back toward the house, then reared in sudden defiance, striking the air with hooves that flashed in the morning sun. The fence rattled, but held. Ethan did not flinch. He sipped his coffee, steady as he could, and spoke low enough that only the horse might hear. "You're not the only one trapped here." The words surprised him, carrying more confession than he intended. By midday, Ethan moved through the chores with a mechanical rhythm, feeding chickens, patching a section of sagging fence, helping his father to the porch where he could watch the world drift by. The old man's eyes lingered on Ash, the restless circle of gray in the pen. "That horse looks like trouble," he murmured, voice thin. Ethan only nodded. Trouble was something he already knew how to live with. The afternoon sun grew harsh, pressing heat against the land, until the air itself seemed to shimmer. Ethan worked silently, sweat soaking his shirt, the sound of Ash's hooves beating a constant counterpoint to his own labors. When evening came, he returned to the corral, this time carrying a bucket of water and a small bundle of hay. The colt snorted, nostrils wide, but did not retreat to the far corner. Instead, Ash watched him with an intensity that made Ethan pause. It was not trust, not yet, but it was attention, and that was more than he expected. He set the hay down, careful not to crowd, and stepped back, leaning once more on the fence. The smell of dry grass filled the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of the hay. Ash lowered his head, testing the offering, muscles taut as if ready to spring away. Then, slowly, he tore into it, chewing noisily in the sun. Evening hush. Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a thin thread of relief winding through his chest. From the porch, his father watched, a shadow against the light spilling from the kitchen window. He said nothing, but Ethan felt the weight of his gaze. The house behind him was failing, the land was tired, and the man inside was fading. Yet here, in the corral, something raw and unbroken still fought to live. Ethan stood in the fading light, listening to the colt's steady chewing, and for the first time in months, the silence between the broken house and the restless corral felt less like emptiness and more like possibility. The air grew heavy before the storm, a stillness that pressed down on the land as if the world were holding its breath. By late afternoon, the Kansas sky had darkened into a deep, bruised purple, clouds rolling low and thick across the horizon. Ethan felt it before he saw it. The sudden hush of birds gone silent, the uneasy shifting of cattle in distant pastures, the way Ash's pacing in the corral had sharpened into something frantic. The colt's ears pinned flat, nostrils flaring, hooves digging at the earth as if he could outrun the pressure building overhead. Ethan set aside the tools he had been using to patch a section of fence. The air tasted metallic, the sure sign of lightning waiting to split the sky. He glanced toward the house where his father's shadow sat stiff on the porch. The old man had lived through countless Kansas storms, but this one made even him shift uneasily. "Better tie that devil down," his father muttered, voice rough with fatigue. Ethan only shook his head. He knew already that ropes would not hold Ash tonight. The first crack of thunder ripped across the fields, startling Ethan as much as the horse. Ash lunged against the fence, rearing so high that for a moment Ethan feared the boards would splinter. His muscles bunched, his eyes flashed white, and he screamed, a wild, piercing sound that swallowed the thunder for a heartbeat. Rain came in sudden sheets, pounding the earth until it turned to mud, soaking Ethan's shirt, plastering his hair to his forehead. He could have run for cover, could have left the colt to his terror, but something in him refused to turn away. He climbed the fence, boots slipping on the wet wood, and dropped into the corral. Lightning forked across the sky, casting the scene in stark silver. Ash spun, snorting, ears wild with panic. Ethan stood tall in the center of the pen, hands loose at his sides, heart pounding so loud it nearly drowned the storm. He spoke. Not loud, not commanding, but steady, each word a thread cast across the chaos. "Easy, boy." Easy now. Just the sky talking. The horse circled, muscles coiled tight, every instinct screaming to flee. Twice he charged close enough that Ethan felt the wind of his body, the spray of rain off his hide. But he did not strike. He only tested, looking for something solid in the madness. Ethan planted his boots in the mud and did not move. He knew what it was to shake with fear, to feel trapped by forces bigger than himself, and he knew what it meant to search desperately for one still point in a world unraveling. For long minutes, the storm raged, and they stood locked in that strange standoff. Ash tossed his head, sides heaving, then finally slowed, his frantic circles easing into jagged lines. His ears flicked forward, catching Ethan's voice between the thunderclaps. Rain streamed off both of them, soaking, chilling, yet neither gave way. Ethan's breath came ragged, but his voice held. "That's it. Stay with me now. Nothing here's gonna take you gradually, impossibly." The Colt stopped. He stood quivering, sides slick and gleaming under the storm's light, eyes still wide but no longer blind with terror. For the first time, he held still within arm's reach. Ethan did not raise a hand. He only breathed, letting the rhythm of his chest speak louder than words. Lightning flashed again, but this time Ash did not bolt. He shuddered, yes, but he stayed. On the porch, Ethan's father watched from the dim glow of the kitchen window, his lined face caught between disbelief and something that looked like hope. In the corral, Ethan stood rooted in the mud, trembling as hard as the horse, yet neither of them broke. Man and Colt, two storms colliding, had found a fragile center of stillness in the heart of the tempest. When the storm finally rolled east, leaving behind a sky torn open with stars, Ethan stepped slowly back toward the fence. Ash stood where he was, head lowered, steam curling from his nostrils in the cooling air. It was not trust, not yet, but it was no longer war. Ethan climbed out of the corral, boots squelching, body aching with exhaustion. On the porch, his father waited with a blanket. Ethan took it wordlessly, wrapping himself as his gaze drifted once more to the gray figure standing calm at last in the mud. He had not tamed Ash. He had not conquered him. But in the eye of the storm, something had shifted between them, a silent understanding, as fragile and fleeting as the stars breaking through the torn clouds. Ethan sank into the porch chair, rain still dripping from his hair, and for the first time in years, he felt the faintest stir of peace. The morning after the storm carried a strange brightness, as though the sky itself had been washed clean. Puddles shone in the rutted driveway, reflecting a pale Kansas sun. Ethan moved stiffly, his body aching from hours spent in the rain, yet his mind was sharper than it had been in months. He couldn't shake the memory of Ash standing still in the storm's heart, trembling but unmoving, listening to his voice. Something had changed. Not much, not enough to call it trust, but enough to plant the seed of possibility. He was carrying a bucket of grain toward the corral when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A battered red pickup rattled into the yard, dust still clinging to its fenders from the county roads. Ethan squinted against the sun as a woman climbed down from the cab, boots sinking into the mud. She was lean, her dark hair pulled back into a practical ponytail, and she carried a black veterinary bag in one hand. "Morning," she called, her voice even, unhurried. "Name's Clara Hayes. Sheriff called me yesterday, said you went and bought yourself trouble at the auction. Thought I'd better stop by before that trouble eats you alive." Ethan set the bucket down, his shoulders tightening. He hadn't asked for company, and he didn't like that word, trouble. But Clara's tone wasn't cruel, just matter-of-fact, as though she'd seen too many wrecked barns and injured horses to waste time on pleasantries. She walked toward the corral, her boots sinking into the soft ground, and stopped just outside the fence. Ash reacted instantly. The Colt spun, ears flat, eyes wide, stomping with a warning snort that sent mud flying. Clara didn't flinch. She only shifted her weight slightly, lowering her gaze, softening her shoulders. Her presence was deliberate but calm, a kind of quiet Ethan recognized only in people who had lived long among animals. "He's underfed," she said after a long moment, her eyes never leaving the colt. "But otherwise, he looks sound." No broken bones, no obvious injuries, just a head full of fire. She turned her face toward Ethan. "What's your plan?" Ethan felt the question land heavier than he expected. What was his plan? He had no tack, no training pen, no money for professional help, only his hands, his time, and the stubborn hope that Ash was worth the fight. He shrugged, wiping a streak of mud from his jeans. "Don't have one yet." Clara studied him the way she had studied the colt, with eyes that seemed to read more than he wanted to share. Finally, she reached into her bag and pulled out a worn paperback. The cover was faded, the spine cracked from years of use. She held it out. "Natural horsemanship. Not about breaking them, not about force. About listening, working with what's already there. Might be the only chance you've got." Ethan took the book reluctantly, his fingers brushing the rough paper. He didn't want to owe anyone, didn't want advice wrapped in pity. But Clara's gaze was steady, without judgment. She wasn't offering a handout. She was offering a tool. Ash snorted again, pawing at the ground. Clara's lips quirked in a half-smile. "He's a fighter. Fighters don't need taming. They need someone who understands what they're fighting against." She stepped back, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "I'll stop in a week or two. See if either of you survived each other." Ethan watched her climb into her truck, the engine coughing to life. As the pickup rumbled down the road, he looked back at the book in his hands. The title was simple, the pages smelling faintly of hay and thyme. Hyun-sung turned toward Ash, who was still circling warily, gray coat flashing in the light. "You hear that?" Ethan murmured, holding up the book. "Patience and listening." "Don't know if I've got either." Ash flicked an ear, then tossed his head, as if dismissing the thought entirely. Ethan leaned against the fence, the book heavy in his palm. For years, his life had been measured in yields, debts, weather forecasts, and the slow unraveling of family. Now, somehow, it was bound to a horse that mirrored every jagged edge inside him. He carried the book into the house that evening. His father eyed it suspiciously from the rocking chair. "You really think words on a page are going to fix that beast?" the old man asked. Ethan didn't answer. He lit the kerosene lamp, opened the book on the kitchen table, and began to read. Outside, the night pressed close, cicadas humming in the dark. Ash paced the corral, restless as ever, but every so often he paused, ears turning toward the glow of the farmhouse. And inside, Ethan traced the words on the page, wondering if patience, something he had lost long ago, could be relearned, and if listening, something he had forgotten, could be enough to turn ashes into flame again. The sound of a diesel engine carried across the dry Kansas fields before the truck itself appeared. Ethan was mending a section of fence by the corral, sweat dripping into the dust, when the gleam of polished chrome came into view. The truck rolled to a stop just beyond the gate, and from it stepped Raymond Carter. He was a man of presence, broad-shouldered, dressed in a crisp shirt that still carried the starch of the iron, his boots polished, his hat unblemished by weather. Everything about him spoke of order, money, and control, the kind Ethan had long ago lost. "Morning," Carter called, his tone clipped, not quite friendly, not openly hostile either. He rested a hand on his belt, gaze drifting past Ethan to the restless colt pacing inside the corral. Ash reacted instantly, Ears back, tail whipping, a sharp squeal that warned of boundaries. Carter's lips curled into something between amusement and disdain. "So it's true," he said. "You're the fool who threw away $8 on that wild brute." Guess I shouldn't be surprised. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, forcing calm into his voice. "I don't remember asking for your opinion." Carter chuckled, a deep sound that carried little humor. He stepped closer to the fence, studying the Colt with a practiced eye. "You know what I see. A lawsuit waiting to happen. That animal's dangerous, Miller. You let him loose near town, he'll hurt someone, and the sheriff will come looking for you. Or worse, he'll hurt you, and no one will be surprised." His words were smooth, yet they cut like wire. Ethan tightened his grip on the hammer, then forced himself to set it down. "He's not dangerous." He's scared. There's a difference, Carter's brow arched, a faint smile tugging at his mouth, as though Ethan's words amused him. "That's the kind of talk you hear from dreamers. And dreamers don't last long out here." He tipped his hat back, his eyes sharp. "You want my advice? Put him down before he puts you down. Or better yet, sell him to me. I've got contacts who know how to handle stock like this." Ash squealed again, as if answering for himself, slamming a hoof against the packed dirt so hard that dust clouded the air. Carter flinched just slightly, though his expression never broke. Ethan stepped closer to the fence, his own voice low, steady. "He's not for sale." For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of things unspoken. Carter's gaze shifted, studying Ethan as though measuring not just the man, but the stubbornness inside him. Finally, he gave a small shrug. "Suit yourself. But don't expect anyone to come running when it all blows up in your face." He turned, boots clicking against gravel, and climbed back into his truck. The engine roared, tires spitting dust as he pulled away, leaving Ethan standing alone in the heat. Ethan leaned on the fence, watching the dust trail fade into the horizon. His chest ached, not with fear, but with the sting of truth laced into Carter's words. Maybe the neighbor was right. Maybe he was foolish, clinging to an animal that mirrored his own broken edges. But when he looked at Ash, still pacing, still defiant, he saw something Carter would never see. He saw a fight worth having. That evening, when the sky bled into gold, Ethan sat on the porch with the book Clara had left. His father rocked silently beside him, the old chair creaking in rhythm with the crickets. "Carter came by," Ethan said finally. His father only nodded, his face unreadable. After a long pause, he spoke. "Raymond's a practical man, sometimes too practical, but he's not always wrong." Ethan turned the page of the book, his thumb rough against the paper. "Maybe. But I'm not him. I can't put down something that's still fighting to live." From the corral came the sound of Ash's hooves, steady now, less frantic than before. Ethan looked up, catching the Colt's silhouette against the rising moon. In that quiet moment, he felt the line drawn sharp between himself and his neighbor. Carter had land, money, reputation. Ethan had only this Colt, this fragile bond in the making. And though the world might call it foolish, he knew where he stood. The days stretched long in the Kansas summer, heat pressing down on the earth until even the cicadas grew weary of their own song. Ethan worked the fields with a weary persistence, patching irrigation lines, checking the crops that still clung to life, his father's cough echoing faintly from the porch. Each evening, he returned to the corral where Ash circled endlessly, a storm trapped in skin and bone. The Colt's restlessness was as constant as the creak of the farmhouse roof, and sometimes Ethan wondered if they were both pacing the same invisible cage. It was on one of those evenings, with the sun slipping low and the air tinged with the scent of cut hay, that Ethan noticed movement by the fence. At first he thought it was a stray dog or one of Carter's calves that had wandered too far. But as he drew closer, he saw a boy, thin, 12 at most, clutching the fence rail with both hands. His sneakers were worn, one lace frayed into threads, and his shirt hung loose on a frame that seemed built more for running than standing still. Ash reacted instantly. The colt's ears snapped back, muscles tensed, and he gave a sharp squeal, trotting the perimeter of the corral in jerky defiance. The boy didn't flinch. He stayed where he was, small fingers white on the wood, eyes wide but steady. Ethan walked over, wiping the sweat from his brow, unsure whether to send him away or ask what he was doing there. "You know that horse'll bite the hand clean off a man," Ethan said, his voice carrying more gruffness than he intended. The boy turned his head slowly. His eyes were dark, serious in a way children's eyes seldom are. "He's not mean," the boy said quietly. "He's scared." Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the certainty in the boy's tone. "Scared, huh? That what you see?" The boy nodded, gaze never leaving the restless figure in the corral. "My mom says when my dad left, I got mean too. But really, I was just scared." He lifted one hand, brushing the back of it across his nose in a gesture more weary than childish. That's how he looks. Like he's waiting for somebody to hurt him again. The words landed harder than Ethan expected. For a moment, he had no reply. He studied the boy, this stranger at his fence, with shoes too small and eyes too old, and then looked back at Ash, who was still circling but with less fire, glancing toward the boy with something that looked almost like curiosity. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. "Ben," the boy answered. "Ben Carter." The last name cut through Ethan's chest like a cold wind. Carter. Raymond Carter, the neighbor who'd come by to sneer at his choices. Ethan's jaw tightened. He considered sending the boy home at once, but Ben's gaze was steady, unflinching, fixed on Ash, as if he'd found something here he couldn't look away from. "You his boy?" Ethan asked finally. Ben shrugged, the gesture small, his shoulders drawn tight. "Mostly I'm just around. My mom says I should stay busy, so I walk. Sometimes I end up here." He looked at Ethan then, his face as solemn as a judge. "Can I come back?" "Just to watch him?" Ethan wanted to say no, wanted to protect what fragile progress he thought he might have with Ash, wanted to keep Carter's name and blood off his land, but the boy's eyes were clear and unguarded, holding something that reminded him of the Colt himself, fragile, brittle, and desperately searching for a place to belong. "You can watch," Ethan said after a long pause, "but you stay on that side of the fence." "He's not ready for company." Ben nodded, relief flickering across his face in the faintest smile. He turned back to the Colt, leaning his chin on the top rail, as if he could wait there forever. Ash slowed his circling, blowing air through flared nostrils, ears twitching in Ben's direction. Ethan crossed his arms, leaning beside the boy, silent. For the first time, the corral felt less like a battlefield and more like a place where two kinds of brokenness might recognize each other. The sun dipped fully below the horizon, leaving only the glow of the porch light behind them. Ethan finally spoke, voice low. "It's getting late. Best head home." Ben climbed down from the fence, brushing dust from his knees. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said simply, and without waiting for permission, he turned and started down the dirt road. Ethan watched him go, the thin figure swallowed by shadows, then turned back to the corral. Ash had stopped pacing, standing still at last, head lifted toward the road where the boy had disappeared. Ethan let out a long breath. Maybe Clara was right. Maybe patience and listening were what this animal needed. And maybe, just maybe, it was what the boy needed too. The air hung heavy that week, a restless heat that clung to skin and soil alike. Ethan rose early, worked the land, tended the livestock, and spent his evenings near the corral. Yet no matter how many hours he poured into the routine, something inside him remained unsettled, like a splinter beneath the flesh. Ash was still wild-eyed, still prone to sudden bursts of rage, and Ethan felt that same violence building quietly in his own chest. One evening, with the sun bleeding red across the horizon, Ethan led Ash into the smaller training pen he had pieced together from old lumber and rusted gates. Ben stood outside the rails, chin perched on his folded arms, watching in silence. Clara had stopped by earlier with more advice. Gentle movements, soft tones, patience. But patience was thin as paper when the colt bucked against every effort. Ethan held the rope, his grip raw from the strain, as Ash tore in circles, muscles coiled like springs, eyes blazing. Sweat poured down Ethan's back, his shirt clinging, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He tried the words Clara had suggested, tried to steady his body, but Ash only jerked harder, nearly yanking him off balance. "Come on," Ethan muttered under his breath, pulling against the force. The rope burned across his palm. "I'm not giving up." The colt lunged, and Ethan lost his footing, stumbling hard into the dust. The jolt rattled through his bones, and before he could regain his grip, Ash reared high, hooves striking the air. The sound split the evening like a gunshot. Ben gasped, gripping the fence, eyes wide with fear. Ethan pushed himself up, rage and shame twisting inside him. He wanted to shout, to throw the rope aside, to curse the sky for giving him more than he could bear. Instead, he stood trembling in the dirt, fists clenched at his sides. His chest heaved as though he'd run miles, but it wasn't exhaustion alone. It was the weight of failure pressing down with brutal clarity. "I can't do this," he said hoarsely, not to Ben, not even to the colt, but to the hollow air around him. His voice cracked, betraying something deeper than frustration. "I'm not scared of you," he whispered, his gaze locked on Ash's restless form. "I'm scared of me. Scared I'll fail again, that all I touch turns to ruin." The words slipped out before he could stop them, raw and jagged as a wound torn open. Ben's face softened, his eyes reflecting something Ethan didn't expect, understanding. The boy didn't speak, only rested his forehead against the fence rail, as though sharing in the weight without needing words. Ash, still snorting, slowed his frantic pacing. The colt's ears flicked forward, catching the tremor in Ethan's voice. For a moment, the storm in the pen seemed to ease, though no one dared move closer. It was a fragile pause, delicate as glass, but it carried a weight that settled heavy in Ethan's chest. When the colt finally calmed enough to stand still, Ethan gathered the rope, his hands shaking. He didn't try again that night. He led Ash back to the larger corral, unfastened the halter, and let him go. The horse trotted away, muscles rippling, but before disappearing into the far shadows, he turned his head briefly, nostrils flaring as if to mark the man who had broken open before him. Ethan slumped on the fence rail, dust clinging to his sweat-soaked skin. eyes stinging not from the heat, but from the tears he refused to shed. The farmhouse lights glowed faint in the distance, his father's silhouette rocking on the porch. Somewhere beyond the fields, Carter's land stretched rich and green, a silent reminder of everything Ethan lacked. And here he sat, with a Colt that refused him, a body that betrayed him, and a boy watching too closely. Ben finally broke the silence, his voice quiet but steady. He doesn't hate you. He just doesn't know you yet. Ethan lifted his head, meeting the boy's gaze. In those young eyes, he saw something that startled him. Hope, fragile, but unyielding. For a long moment, neither spoke again. The evening cooled, stars pricked the sky, and the fracture inside Ethan remained. But it no longer felt hidden. It had been spoken, witnessed, shared in silence by a boy and a Colt who understood brokenness in ways words could never capture. The following morning dawned softer, the sky brushed with a pale lavender that promised a rare break from the relentless heat. Ethan moved slowly through his chores, his body sore from the failed training session, his mind heavier still. He had lain awake much of the night, replaying every moment. Ash's wild rearing, his own collapse in the dirt, the words he'd let slip into the open. He had told the truth out loud for the first time, that he feared himself more than the horse. And though the admission had left him raw, there was also something cleansing in it, as though the wound, once bared, might finally begin to heal. When he walked past the corral, Ash stood near the rail, not pacing, not frantic, but watching. The Colt's eyes followed him with a wariness that seemed different now, not just suspicion, but curiosity. Ethan stopped, met the gaze, and for the first time did not look away. "Morning, Ash," he said simply. The words hung in the cool air like a greeting between neighbors learning to coexist. Later that day, Ben appeared again, carrying 2 apples in his hands. He perched on the fence rail, legs swinging, his presence now familiar enough that even Ethan's father had stopped asking questions. Ethan joined him, leaning against the post, while Ash circled at a slower, more thoughtful pace. Ben extended a palm, one of the apples resting in its center. "Think he'll take it?" the boy asked. "Not yet," Ethan replied, "but maybe soon." They waited together, the minutes stretching. The barn creaked with the shifting heat, swallows darted through broken rafters, and the smell of hay hung thick in the air. Ash paused once, ears flicking toward the apple, nostrils flaring, then tossed his head and moved away again. Still, it was something, a hesitation, where before there had been only refusal. That night, Ethan carried a lamp to the barn and sat on an overturned bucket just outside the corral. The glow painted long shadows on the walls, the air filled with the quiet rustle of straw. He brought the book Clara had left, opened it across his knees, and began to read aloud. His voice was rough, halting at first, but the steady rhythm of words soon filled the space. Ash shifted, ears swiveling toward the sound. "You work with what the horse gives you," Ethan read, the words clumsy on his tongue, but resonant all the same. "Trust is not taken. It is offered." He glanced up to find Ash standing closer to the fence than before, his eyes catching the lamplight like twin embers. Ethan's heart thudded, but he kept his voice even, continued reading. Hours passed that way, man and Colt bound by words neither fully understood, but both somehow needed. When Ethan finally closed the book, his throat dry, Ash remained by the rail, still and listening. The silence that followed was deeper than before, not empty but full of a quiet recognition. Ethan whispered into the dark, "We're figuring this out, you and me." The next morning, Ben arrived again, and this time Ethan handed him one of the apples. "Hold it flat on your palm," he instructed. The boy's hand trembled slightly, but he did as told, stepping closer to the fence. Ash eyed the offering, his muscles twitching with the urge to bolt, then lowered his head slowly, nostrils quivering. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden decisiveness, Ash snatched the apple, crunching loudly before retreating a few steps. Ben's face lit up, his grin stretching wide, and Ethan felt something stir in his own chest. A flicker of pride, of hope, of the possibility that perhaps he had not been wrong to believe. Ash chewed, eyes still wary, but when he looked back at them, there was no longer only fear in his gaze. There was a question, tentative and fragile. Could this continue? Ethan nodded, as if answering a thought spoken without words. "Yeah, boy," he said softly. "We'll keep going." That night, as the sun slipped behind the horizon, Ethan lingered in the barn longer than usual. He watched Ash settle, head dipping into the hay, the restless pacing gone for the moment. The quiet filled the space like a balm. It was not victory, not even close, but it was something more precious. The first small flame against the long dark. And for Ethan, who had nearly given up on light altogether, it was enough to keep him moving forward. The heat of late summer lingered stubbornly, each day a haze of cicada song and air so heavy it felt like wading through water. Ethan had settled into a rhythm. Mornings spent repairing irrigation lines and tending what little crop had survived the dry spell. Afternoons with Ash in the corral. Evenings often joined by Ben, who came faithfully, sometimes with apples, sometimes just to sit and watch. Clara visited now and then, her pickup raising dust down the long road, checking Ash's progress with a quiet nod that said more than words. Slowly, cautiously, the Colt had begun to change. He still snorted and paced, but he no longer spun himself into panic at the sight of an outstretched hand. Each small step was a fragile victory, and Ethan counted them like coins he could not afford to lose. One evening, Clara leaned against the fence, her hat pushed back, her eyes scanning the Colt's careful movements. "You know the county fair's coming up," she said casually, though her gaze never left Ash. Ethan grunted, not looking up from where he was coiling a rope. "Always does." "There's a division for rescue horses this year," Clara continued. "Not a show, not ribbons for perfect posture or bloodlines. Just a chance to bring them out, let folks see what progress looks like. Some of the kids bring theirs, small exhibitions, a walk through an obstacle course. It's meant to show what patience can do." Ethan froze, the rope tightening in his hands. He could already hear the laughter, the whispers, the muttered words about foolish men and wasted money. The memory of Carter's smirk burned in his mind. "He's not ready," Ethan said flatly, "and neither am I." Ben, perched on the fence rail, perked up at the mention of the fair. "You should do it," he blurted, his voice eager. "People should see him. They think he's mean, but they're wrong. If they saw him with you, with us." He stopped, cheeks flushing, but his eyes were bright, full of a hope Ethan hadn't seen in years. Clara shrugged, a faint smile playing at her lips. "No pressure. Just think about it. Sometimes showing up is its own kind of victory." She tipped her hat and walked back to her truck, leaving Ethan staring at the dust her tires kicked into the sunset. That night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with the fair flyer Clara had left. The paper was creased, the ink smudged, but the words were clear enough. Rescue Horse Exhibition, October 10th. His father sat across from him, sipping weak coffee, his face lined with the weight of years. "You considering it?" the old man asked. Ethan shook his head, though the flyer remained under his hand. He'd panic. Crowd that big, noise, lights, he'd fall apart. His father studied him for a long time, then set the mug down. Or maybe he wouldn't. Maybe you're the one afraid of the crowd. The words were gentle, not cruel, but they hit harder than Carter's barbs had. Ethan folded the flyer and shoved it into his pocket, unable to answer. In the days that followed, the thought lingered like a burr under his skin. He found himself working with Ash differently, imagining what it might take to guide him through a simple course, to stand steady while strangers looked on. Each time the Colt startled at a bird's sudden flight or the creak of a gate, Ethan felt the knot of doubt tighten. Yet Ben's words echoed too, stubborn as weeds. People should see him. One afternoon, as the sky lowered with the promise of rain, Ethan brought Ash into the smaller pen. Ben watched, his chin resting on his folded arms. Ethan spoke low, steady, coaxing the Colt toward a tarp laid flat on the ground. At first, Ash balked, snorting, pawing at the dirt. Ethan waited, giving him space, remembering Clara's advice. After a long hesitation, Ash stepped forward, one hoof pressing down on the crinkling fabric. He flinched, but did not retreat. Another step, then another, until he had crossed. Ben whooped softly, clapping his hands once before catching himself. Ethan let out a long breath, something loosening in his chest. The tarp was no fairground, but it was a start. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking toward the boy. "Don't get ahead of yourself." "He's still got a long way to go." Ben grinned, undeterred. "Then we better keep practicing." That evening, Ethan pulled the flyer from his pocket again, smoothing the creases on the kitchen table. The lamplight flickered, shadows shifting across the words. His father said nothing this time, only watched from his chair as Ethan traced the date with his thumb. He wasn't ready to commit, not yet. But the thought of standing in that ring, of letting others see what Ash had become, even if they didn't win, even if they failed, felt less impossible than it had before. Ethan folded the flyer, once more, and slipped it back into his pocket. Outside, Ash shifted in the corral, his silhouette framed against the pale wash of moonlight. The Colt snorted softly, ears turning toward the farmhouse as though waiting. Ethan whispered to the empty room, "Maybe." And though the word was small, it felt like the beginning of a door opening. The September sun had begun to soften, its heat no longer the oppressive weight of midsummer, but a gentler warmth, tinged with the first whispers of autumn. The fields shimmered with fading green, and evenings came earlier now, shadows stretching long across the farmyard. Ethan had fallen into a rhythm with Ash. Small exercises in the training pen, patience when the Colt balked, quiet praise when he dared to step forward. Ben came nearly every day, his eyes bright with anticipation, and even Ethan's father had taken to watching from the porch with something almost like pride. The fair still loomed in Ethan's mind, its date circled quietly on the calendar, but he didn't speak of it aloud. Hope, he knew, could be a fragile thing. One late afternoon, after chores, Ethan led Ash into the smaller pen to practice. The air smelled of damp earth, the sky heavy with clouds promising rain. Ben clambered onto the fence rail, eager as ever. "What's he doing today?" he asked. "Just some groundwork," Ethan replied, clicking his tongue as he guided the colt. Ash moved reluctantly at first, ears flicking, then settled into a trot, his hooves drumming a steady beat against the packed soil. Ethan's grip on the rope was loose, his voice low, coaxing, steady. For a while it felt easy, the kind of moment that gave him faith in the slow work of change. But then it happened. Quick, brutal in its simplicity. Ash stumbled, his front hoof catching on the uneven ground near the pen's edge. He let out a sharp snort and jerked sideways, nearly pulling the rope from Ethan's hands. Dust flew as the colt limped, favoring his right leg. Ethan's stomach dropped. "Whoa, easy," he murmured, heart hammering as he eased the rope slack. Ash shifted uneasily, testing his weight, but the limp was clear, the pain visible in the tension rippling through his body. Ben's voice cracked with worry. "Is he hurt bad?" "I don't know," Ethan said quickly, his throat tight. He led Ash slowly toward the gate, each step uneven, the colt's ears pinned back in discomfort. Ethan's chest ached at the sight, the proud, fiery animal reduced to this fragile imbalance. All the progress of the past weeks seemed to crumble with each faltering step. By the time he reached the barn, Ethan's father had appeared on the porch, concern etched into his weathered face. "What happened?" "He tripped," Ethan answered, guiding Ash into the stall. "Could be nothing. Could be worse." His voice betrayed more fear than he intended. He crouched, running a hand carefully down Ash's leg, feeling the heat rising from the swollen joint near the fetlock. His heart sank. Clara arrived within the hour, her truck kicking up gravel as it barreled into the yard. She crouched by the stall, her hands practiced and calm, eyes sharp in the dim light. After what felt like forever, she rose, brushing hay from her knees. "Mild sprain," she said at last. Relief washed over Ethan, though it was tempered by her next words. "He'll need rest. 2 weeks minimum, no heavy work. Keep him quiet, cold compresses if you can manage. Push him too soon, and you'll have more than a sprain on your hands." Ethan exhaled hard, leaning against the stall door. 2 weeks? The fair's in less than a month. Clara's eyes softened, but held steady. Then you'll have a choice to make. His health, or your pride. Ben looked between them, his face pale. "We can still go, right? He'll get better." His voice wavered, hope clinging to each word. Ethan couldn't bring himself to answer. That night, the farmhouse was silent. His father dozed in the chair. The clock ticked on the mantel, and Ethan sat at the table with the fair flyer in front of him. His hands turned it over and over, crumpling the edges, his chest heavy with doubt. He had allowed himself to imagine it, the fairground, the crowd, Ash walking steady by his side. Now the image faltered, cracked by the sight of the colt limping in the dust. He rose at last and stepped outside. The night was cool, the stars sharp in their clarity. From the barn came the sound of Ash shifting in his stall, restless but contained. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, staring into the dark. He had thought himself ready to face laughter, judgment, even failure. But he hadn't prepared for this, for the possibility that fate itself might steal the chance before it ever came. And yet, as he listened to the quiet rhythm of the Colt's breathing, a stubborn ember flickered within him. Injured or not, they were still bound together, still walking the same path. The fair might slip from their grasp, but the journey was not over. He whispered into the night, the words carrying more to himself than to the horse. "We'll get through this. One way or another." The barn was dim and cool in the early morning, the air rich with the scent of hay and dust. Ethan stood at the stall door, watching Ash shift uncomfortably on 3 strong legs, the 4th still tender from the sprain. The colt's head lowered as he blew softly into the straw, ears flicking at the faint sounds of the waking farm. The fair flyer was folded in Ethan's back pocket, the date pressing against his thoughts with every breath. 2 weeks of rest meant 2 weeks of lost training. The fair was no longer a goal, but a question mark that loomed larger each day. Ethan rested his arms on the stall door, his voice low. "We were close, boy. Closer than I thought we'd get. Now I don't know." Ash lifted his head at the sound, his eyes catching the thin beam of morning light. Didn't understand words, but something in his stillness felt like an answer. Ben came each afternoon, his sneakers scuffing the dirt, his hands carrying apples or carrots. He never asked to work with Ash anymore. Instead, he sat by the stall, reading aloud from school books or simply talking in the unguarded way children do. Ash listened, ears tilting toward the boy's voice, his breath steady, no longer restless. For Ben, the stall had become a safe place, and Ethan noticed how the boy's shoulders relaxed each time he stepped inside the barn. Clara stopped by every few days, checking Ash's leg with practiced fingers, her expression unreadable. "He's healing," she said finally, one evening as rain pattered on the tin roof. "But you'll have to decide. Push him too soon and he'll carry that limp for life. Give him time and he'll come back stronger. The fair... You may need to let it go." The words struck Ethan like hammer blows. He'd never admitted aloud how much the fair had come to mean. Not the ribbons or the recognition, but the chance to show the town, to show himself, that Ash was more than a mistake. It was supposed to be their moment, proof that they had both survived. But now, faced with Clara's steady gaze, he found himself nodding. His health comes first. That night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the flyer open in front of him. His father sat across the room, rocking slowly, his breath wheezy but calm. "You thinking of pulling out?" the old man asked. Ethan stared at the date, October 10th, circled in blue ink. He rubbed the back of his neck, the silence heavy. "It's the right thing," he said finally. "I can't risk him." His father studied him for a long time, then leaned back in the chair. "Right thing doesn't always mean easy thing. Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones no one sees." Ethan folded the flyer, tucked it back into his pocket, and rose without another word. He walked out to the barn, the night air cool against his face, stars scattered bright above the fields. Ash stood in the stall, head low, his breath stirring the hay. Ethan stepped inside, resting a hand lightly against the colt's neck. For a moment, Ash didn't move. Then, slowly, he leaned into the touch, the weight subtle but unmistakable. It was the first time Ethan felt the full warmth of that trust, not forced, not taken, but offered in silence. The choice had been made, though no words were spoken. The fair would wait, or perhaps it would never come at all. What mattered was here, in the quiet bond that had grown between a man and a horse, who both knew what it meant to lose and to keep going anyway. Ethan whispered into the dim, his voice steady now. "We don't need a crowd to know who we are." Ash's ears flicked, his breath deep and even, as though he agreed. Outside, the wind moved through the dry corn, whispering over the fields. Inside the barn, the silence held a kind of peace Ethan hadn't felt in years. The fair no longer stood as a measure of worth. What mattered was that in the solitude of their broken lives, they had chosen to keep walking forward. Together. October arrived with a sharp edge in the air, the kind of chill that carried the scent of hay bales, fried dough, and wood smoke. The fairgrounds in the county seat swelled with color and sound, banners snapping in the breeze, children's laughter carrying over the clang of rides, the steady murmur of livestock penned for judging. Ethan hadn't planned on coming, not after Clara's warning, not after he'd whispered to Ash in the quiet of the barn that they didn't need the world's approval. But the days since had gnawed at him. Ben's face, lit with hope every time he mentioned the fair, had pressed against Ethan's doubts, like a steady hand refusing to let go. That morning, Ethan loaded Ash into the trailer with careful patience. The Colt hesitated, snorting at the echoing walls of the rig. But after a pause, he stepped inside. Ben was there too, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. Clara followed behind in her pickup, her window rolled down. "It doesn't have to be perfect," she said as she passed. "Just honest." Ethan nodded, his throat too tight for words. The fairgrounds were already alive when they arrived. Ash trembled the moment his hooves touched unfamiliar dirt, his muscles rippling under his gray coat. The crowd's hum seemed to press from every side. Balloons bobbing, music blaring from speakers, livestock calling out from stalls. Ethan felt his own chest tighten, the old ache of being watched, measured, judged. He placed a hand on the Colt's neck, steady, grounding. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "We're here together." They were assigned a small holding pen near the arena. Other horses passed by. Sleek ponies led by children in crisp shirts, calm geldings guided by handlers who walked with confidence. Ash tossed his head, ears flicking wildly, his body vibrating with nerves. Ethan could feel the judgment in the glances cast their way, the whispered comments not so different from the auction weeks ago. Wild, dangerous, mistake. Ben leaned on the rail, his young face pale but resolute. "He can do it," he whispered fiercely, more to himself than to anyone else. Ethan felt the words strike deep, a reminder of why they had come. This wasn't about winning ribbons. It was about showing that survival itself was worth standing before others. When their turn came, Ethan walked into the arena with Ash at his side, every muscle taut, every step deliberate. The noise of the crowd swelled, but Ethan focused only on the Colt beside him. The first task was simple, a circle around the ring. Ash resisted at first, his body jerking, eyes wide, but Ethan's voice was steady. "With me," he murmured. Slowly, Ash began to move in rhythm, the circle unsteady but complete. A ripple of surprise moved through the stands. Next came the obstacle, a tarp stretched across the ground. Ethan paused, waiting. Ash planted his hooves, head high, snorting. Ethan didn't pull. He simply stood beside him, letting the Colt test the space. Minutes passed, tension thick enough to choke. Then, as if remembering the night in the barn with Ben and the apple, Ash lowered his head, sniffed the tarp, and stepped forward. One hoof, then another. The sound of hooves crinkling the fabric echoed in the hushed arena. When Ash reached the other side, the crowd erupted into applause. The final challenge was a narrow wooden bridge. As they approached, a balloon popped in the stands, sharp and sudden. Ash startled, jerking sideways, nearly bolting. Ethan's heart seized, but he didn't tighten the rope. He planted his boots, opened his hands, and let his voice flow calm and low. "It's all right. Nothing here will hurt you." Ash quivered, eyes rolling white, then looked at Ethan. For one breathless instant, man and horse stood locked together, the noise of the crowd falling away. Then Ash stepped forward, hooves finding the boards of the bridge. Each step was slow, careful, deliberate, until they reached the other side. When they finished, Ethan let the rope hang loose. Ash stood tall, his sides heaving, but he did not retreat. The applause was louder now, warm and genuine. Ethan hardly heard it. His eyes were on the Colt, whose head had lowered, ears flicking back and forth as if listening to a language only the two of them shared. Ben ran to the gate, his grin wide enough to light the entire fairground. Clara stood behind him, her eyes bright with pride. Ethan's father was there too, leaning on his cane, his face lined but softened in a way Ethan hadn't seen in years. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt no shame in being seen. They didn't win first place. They didn't need to. A ribbon was placed in Ben's hands, 5th out of a dozen entries, and the boy pinned it proudly to Ash's halter. "You did it," he whispered into the Colt's ear. Ash flicked his tail, standing steady beneath the weight of the boy's trust. For Ethan, the arena was more than a stage. It was proof that broken things, given patience and care, could stand before the world and not collapse. And as he led Ash back toward the holding pen, he knew this day was not an end, but the truest kind of beginning. The fairgrounds emptied slowly, the once bustling arena now quiet except for the rustle of discarded paper cups and the faint creak of rides winding down for the night. The bright carnival lights dimmed one by one, their glow fading into the Kansas dark. Ethan stood by the trailer, loosening Ash's halter, his body still humming with the weight of the day. The ribbon hung from the Colt's halter, small and unremarkable to anyone else, but in Ethan's eyes it gleamed brighter than gold. Ben hovered nearby, too excited to be tired. He kept touching the ribbon, grinning at Ash as though he had led the Colt through the course himself. Clara leaned against the side of her truck, arms crossed, her eyes soft with a satisfaction she didn't try to hide. Ethan's father sat on a folding chair they'd brought, his cane across his knees, his expression calm. For the first time in years, the silence between them didn't feel strained. When the last of the crowd had gone, Ethan led Ash into the trailer. The Colt stepped inside with only a brief hesitation, calmer than he'd ever been in a strange place. Ethan closed the gate, patted the metal once, then turned to Ben. "Time to get you home," he said. The boy's smile faltered just a little, as though he wished the night could stretch on forever. "He was amazing," Ben whispered. They all saw it. They know now Ethan studied him in the dim glow of the parking lot. It doesn't matter what they saw. What matters is what we did. He ruffled Ben's hair, a gesture that startled them both with its ease. The boy grinned again, brighter than before, and ran to climb into Clara's truck for the ride back. The drive home was quiet. Ash shifted only once in the trailer, steady on his feet as the road unspooled beneath the wheels. Ethan's father dozed in the passenger seat, his breathing rough but even. Ethan kept his eyes on the dark road ahead, the fair's sounds still echoing faintly in his ears. Applause, children's laughter, the sharp pop of a balloon. But what lingered most was not the noise. It was the silence that had followed Ash's final step onto the bridge, the breathless hush when the Colt had chosen to trust. Back at the farm, the night was still. The stars shone sharp above the fields, their cold light scattered across the land. Ethan unloaded Ash, leading him into the corral. The Colt walked with his head low but steady, no longer frantic, no longer fighting invisible battles. He paused by the rail, lifting his nose to the sky, then snorted softly as though satisfied to be home. Ethan leaned against the fence, the ribbon still clutched in his hand. It wasn't the prize that mattered. It was the proof that survival could be seen, that broken things could stand tall in the light, even if only for a moment. He thought of Carter's smirk at the auction, the pitying glances of neighbors, the doubts he himself had carried like stones. Tonight, all of it had shifted. His father shuffled up behind him, the cane tapping lightly against the dirt. "You did well," the old man said simply. The words were plain, but they carried more weight than any judge's score. Ethan swallowed hard, nodding once. When the others had gone inside, Ethan stayed. Ash paced the edge of the corral, then stopped to stand near him, ears flicking in the quiet. Ethan reached over the fence, his hand resting briefly on the Colt's warm neck. The touch was light, respectful, but Ash did not shy away. He leaned into it, just enough to let Ethan know. The trust was real. The lights of the fair were miles away now, nothing more than a memory fading into the dark. But in that silence, under the vast Kansas sky, Ethan felt something settle deep inside him. Not triumph, not victory, but peace. The kind that comes after years of noise when, at last, everything grows quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat again. He whispered into the stillness, more prayer than statement. "We're home, Ash, and we're not the same as we were." The Colt shifted closer, breathing against Ethan's hand, and together they stood in the dark, two survivors of storms and scars, at last finding comfort not in the world's applause, but in the quiet bond they had built when no one was watching. Winter passed slowly, each dawn bringing pale light across the frozen fields, each evening wrapping the farm in long shadows and silence. Ethan worked through the cold, mending fences with numb fingers, scattering feed over snow, his father watching from the porch bundled in blankets. Ash grew stronger, his limp long gone, his coat thick and shining against the frost. The Colt had lost none of his spirit, but the wild fear that once drove him seemed quieter now, tempered by the steady rhythm of care and patience. Spring arrived at last, soft and tentative, turning the fields green again. The barn doors stood open to let in the warm wind, and swallows swooped overhead, stitching the sky with their flight. By then, the idea had taken root in Ethan's mind, a seed planted during long nights at the kitchen table with Clara, Ben, and his father. The fair had shown them what was possible. The farm had always been more than a piece of land. It was a place of survival, of second chances. What if it could be that for others too? They painted a new sign one Saturday morning, the wood sanded smooth, the letters carved by hand. When it was raised at the edge of the drive, sunlight struck across the words, Ash Haven Ranch. The name belonged to the Colt, but it belonged to Ethan too, and to anyone who carried scars unseen. It was a promise that brokenness could be met with patience and fear could be turned into trust. Neighbors began to come, hesitant at first. A girl who had lost her father to an accident found quiet in brushing Ash's mane. A retired soldier, shoulders heavy with silence, stood in the corral one evening and felt something shift inside him when Ash met his gaze without judgment. Even Carter's voice softened. One afternoon he stopped by, watching Ben lead Ash around the pen, and though he said little, there was no disdain in his eyes. Clara's visits grew more frequent, her laughter filling the farmhouse where silence had once settled heavy. She was part of it now too, guiding the work, reminding Ethan when to be cautious, when to be bold. Ben was always there, a fixture on the fence rail, his eyes brighter than they had been when he first appeared, his shoulders no longer slumped with defeat. The boy carried a kind of hope that fed everyone around him, and Ash seemed to respond to him most of all, lowering his head whenever Ben approached, as if the two were bound by some secret understanding. On a mild evening in early summer, Ethan stood in the pasture, watching Ash graze under the setting sun. The land stretched wide and forgiving, the fields shimmering with new growth, the farmhouse warm with lamplight. His father dozed inside, his breathing even. Clara and Ben sat on the porch steps, their voices carrying softly on the breeze. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something more than survival. He felt belonging. Ash lifted his head, ears pricked, eyes catching the last rays of light. He stepped closer, his powerful frame casting a long shadow across the grass. Ethan reached out, his hand resting on the colt's neck, the bond between them solid and unspoken. "We made it," he whispered, the words nearly lost to the wind. Ash's breath stirred against his skin, warm and steady. The farm was no longer just a place of debts and labor. It had become a refuge, a sanctuary for the unwanted, the broken, the ones who needed a place to heal. And in giving that to others, Ethan had found healing himself. He no longer measured his life in failed harvests or unopened bank letters, but in small victories, a child's laughter in the barn, a horse's calm where there had once been terror, the quiet strength of knowing he was no longer alone. As twilight deepened, the new sign at the gate caught the last glow of the day. Ash Haven Ranch. It stood as more than a name. It was a testament, carved into wood and written across every scar they carried, that ashes are not the end, but the beginning of what rises after the fire. And that's how a farmer's last $8 turned into a bond that no one believed was possible. If this story touched you, just drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. I'll know you were here till the very end. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next true story of courage, healing, and second chances between humans and horses. Your next favorite story is waiting.